In the quiet town of Maplewood, where everyone seemed to follow unwritten rules about how things should be, 16-year-old Nia Johnson stood out, not just because of her bright smile or sharp mind, but because she dared to be herself. That morning, as sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, Nia took a deep breath and looked at her reflection in the mirror. She had spent hours carefully styling her natural hair into a proud afro, a decision that felt both bold and deeply personal. For years, she'd straightened her curls to fit in, but today was different. Today, she wanted to embrace who she truly was. Nia's high school, Maplewood High, wasn't known for celebrating individuality. Its hallways were filled with students wearing uniforms so neatly pressed they almost blended into one another. Even the dress code policy included vague wording about hairstyles needing to look neat and professional. But Nia didn't think twice as she walked onto campus that day. Her heart raced with excitement, not fear. She felt beautiful. The first few periods passed without incident. Teachers greeted her warmly, and classmates whispered compliments under their breath. However, by lunchtime, whispers turned into stares, and soon enough, Assistant Principal Mr. Grayson appeared outside her classroom door. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a permanent scowl etched onto his face. Known for enforcing rules strictly, he rarely cracked a smile. When he called Nia out of class, the entire room fell silent. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice cold and clipped. "Your hairstyle does not comply with our school's dress code policy. You'll need to go home and fix it before returning." Nia blinked, stunned. "Fix it?" she repeated softly, her voice trembling. "What's wrong with my hair?" Mr. Grayson crossed his arms, avoiding eye contact. "It's distracting and, frankly, unprofessional. We expect students to maintain a certain standard here." "Distracting? Unprofessional?" The words hit Nia like a punch to the stomach. Her hands instinctively went to her hair, touching the coils she'd worked so hard to style. How could something so natural, so much a part of her identity, be considered wrong? Word spread quickly around the school. By the end of the day, photos of Nia and snippets of her confrontation with Mr. Grayson had made their way onto social media. Students debated heatedly in the cafeteria, some defending Nia while others shrugged off the incident as just following the rules. Meanwhile, Nia sat alone on a bench near the football field, tears streaming down her cheeks. She felt humiliated, angry, and confused, all at once. Her mother, Angela, arrived shortly after receiving a call from the school office. A strong woman who had always taught Nia to love herself no matter what, Angela couldn't hide her fury when she heard the reason behind the suspension. "This isn't about professionalism," Angela muttered as she hugged her daughter tightly. "This is about control." As they drove home together, Nia stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. She didn't understand why people couldn't see her for who she was, a smart, kind, ambitious young woman, instead of focusing on her hair. Little did she know, this moment would spark a chain reaction that would uncover secrets buried deep within Maplewood High and expose a side of Mr. Grayson no one saw coming. By the next morning, Nia's suspension had become the talk of Maplewood High. Students huddled in groups during breaks, whispering about what had happened. Some defended Nia, calling the situation unfair and outdated. Others sided with the administration, saying rules were rules, regardless of how they felt personally. But one thing was clear. The incident had ignited a firestorm. Nia stayed home that day, her heart heavy but her resolve growing stronger. Sitting at the kitchen table with her mom, Angela, she scrolled through messages on her phone. Friends sent supportive texts, classmates shared screenshots of online petitions demanding change, and even strangers from other schools chimed in with words of encouragement. Seeing so many people rally behind her gave Nia a sense of strength she hadn't expected. Still, she couldn't shake the sting of being singled out for something as simple and natural as her hair. Meanwhile, back at school, tensions simmered. During third period, a group of students organized an impromptu protest outside the principal's office. They held up handmade signs that read, "My hair, my identity, and respect our roots." Teachers tried to disperse them, warning that participating could result in detention, but the students refused to budge. Among them was Marcus, Nia's best friend since middle school. He stood at the front of the crowd, his voice steady as he addressed anyone who would listen. "This isn't just about Nia," Marcus said loudly, holding up a picture of her smiling proudly in her afro. "It's about all of us. It's about being told we're not good enough because of how we look. That's not okay." Inside his office, Mr. Grayson watched the commotion unfold through his window. His jaw tightened as he leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the desk. He hated disruptions, especially ones that drew attention to him. Picking up the phone, he called the head custodian to remind him to clear the hallway before lunch. As much as he wanted to ignore the protests, he couldn't deny that this was getting out of hand. The media soon caught wind of the story. Local news outlets began covering the controversy, interviewing parents, teachers, and students. One reporter managed to get a brief statement from Angela, who spoke passionately about raising her daughter to love herself despite societal pressures. "No child should ever feel ashamed of their natural appearance," Angela said firmly. "This policy doesn't protect professionalism. It perpetuates discrimination." While most of the community rallied around Nia, not everyone agreed. Some parents argued that schools had the right to enforce dress codes, claiming it helped maintain discipline. Others dismissed the backlash as overblown, insisting that Nia should have simply complied with the rules. These conflicting opinions only fueled the debate further, turning what started as a personal issue into a town-wide conversation. Amidst the chaos, Mr. Grayson found himself increasingly isolated. Staff members avoided making eye contact with him in the hallways, and even his closest colleagues seemed hesitant to discuss the matter. At home that evening, he sat alone in his dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the television. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. Was he wrong to suspend Nia? Or was he just doing his job? What Mr. Grayson didn't realize was that someone else had been watching the events unfold closely, and they weren't planning to stay silent. A retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson, who had worked at Maplewood High decades earlier, decided it was time to speak up. She knew things about Mr. Grayson's past, secrets that might explain why he clung so tightly to these rigid policies. And when she finally revealed what she knew, no one would see him the same way again. As the days passed, the tension in Maplewood continued to build. Nia's story wasn't just about hair anymore. It had become a symbol of something much bigger, a fight for respect, equality, and the courage to stand up for oneself. Unbeknownst to everyone, including Nia herself, the truth about Mr. Grayson's dark past was about to come crashing down, leaving the entire town speechless. The protests outside Maplewood High grew louder with each passing day. Students continued to gather in the mornings, holding signs and chanting slogans about fairness and self-expression. Teachers walked past them nervously, unsure whether to intervene or let the demonstrations run their course. Even parents joined in, some driving up to the school gates after work to show support for Nia. The once quiet town of Maplewood was now buzzing with energy, its residents divided between those who saw this as a necessary stand against injustice and those who believed rules were meant to be followed without question. Nia, still suspended, spent most of her days at home scrolling through social media updates about the movement she had unintentionally sparked. She felt a mix of pride and guilt. Pride that so many people cared enough to speak out, but guilt that her suspension had caused such an uproar. Her mother, Angela, tried to reassure her. "You didn't ask for any of this," Angela said one evening as they sat together on the couch. But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for others too. While the spotlight remained firmly on Nia, whispers began circulating about someone else entirely. Mr. Grayson. Retired teacher Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman in her late 70s with snow-white hair and a sharp memory, decided it was time to break her silence. For years, she had kept quiet about things she'd witnessed during her time at Maplewood High, fearing backlash or dismissal. But seeing Nia's story unfold reignited old memories and anger that she couldn't ignore any longer. Mrs. Patterson reached out to Angela first, explaining that she might have information relevant to the situation. Curious and cautious, Angela invited her over for tea later that week. Sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, Mrs. Patterson hesitated before speaking. "I don't know if what I'm about to tell you will help," she began softly, "but I think you deserve to hear it." She went on to explain that when she worked at the school decades ago, Mr. Grayson had been a young vice principal eager to prove himself. Back then, he enforced strict policies not just on dress codes, but also on behavior and academics. One incident stood out vividly in her mind. A student named Marcus Thompson, a talented artist known for his creativity and free spirit, had clashed repeatedly with Mr. Grayson over minor infractions like wearing bright-colored sneakers or sketching during class. "Marcus reminded me of your daughter," Mrs. Patterson told Angela, her voice tinged with sadness. "He was confident, unapologetic, and full of potential. But Mr. Grayson made life difficult for him. He suspended Marcus multiple times until the boy eventually dropped out." Angela listened intently, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What happened to him?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson sighed. "No one really knows. After leaving school, Marcus disappeared from town. Some say he moved away. Others claim he struggled with depression. Either way, it broke my heart. And now, seeing what's happening with Nia, it feels like history repeating itself." Determined to share her story, Mrs. Patterson contacted a local journalist covering the controversy. Though hesitant at first, she agreed to an interview, knowing it could bring attention to the deeper issues at play. When the article appeared online 2 days later, it sent shockwaves through the community. Titled "Principal's Past Raises Questions About School Policies," it detailed Mrs. Patterson's account of Marcus Thompson's struggles and questioned whether Mr. Grayson's actions stemmed from prejudice or misplaced authority. At school, Mr. Grayson read the article in stunned silence. His face turned pale as he realized the scrutiny wasn't going to end anytime soon. Colleagues avoided him even more than before, and students glared at him in the hallways. For the first time, cracks began to show in his usually stoic demeanor. That night, alone in his house, he sifted through old files and photographs, memories flooding back that he'd long buried. Unbeknownst to everyone, however, there was another piece of the puzzle yet to emerge. A letter written by Marcus Thompson years ago, addressed directly to Mr. Grayson. If found, it could change everything. As tensions mounted and secrets unraveled, Nia prepared herself for what came next. Little did she know the truth would force the entire town to confront uncomfortable realities and redefine what justice truly meant. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped discreetly under the door of Mr. Grayson's office while he was in a meeting with the school board. It was an unassuming envelope, slightly yellowed with age, its edges worn as if it had been tucked away for years. Written in neat cursive on the front were the words, "To Principal Grayson, please read when ready." There was no return, address, no indication of who had sent it or why. When Mr. Grayson returned to his desk and noticed the envelope, his stomach tightened. Something about it felt ominous, like a ghost from his past reaching out to haunt him. For a moment he considered tossing it into the trash without opening it. But curiosity, and perhaps guilt, got the better of him. With trembling hands, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter began simply, "Dear Mr. Grayson, if you're reading this, I hope it means you've finally started to question your actions. I'm writing this not to blame you, but to make sure you understand the impact of what you've done." Mr. Grayson froze. His eyes darted around the room as though expecting someone to appear and explain how this letter existed. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Marcus Thompson, the student Mrs. Patterson had spoken about in her interview, the same boy whose life had unraveled under his watch. As he read further, the words hit him like a punch, to the chest. "I used to love school," the letter continued. "I loved learning, creating art, and dreaming about all the things I could become. But somewhere along the way, those dreams were crushed, not by failure, but by rules that made me feel like I wasn't good enough. You told me my sneakers were too loud, my sketches were a distraction, and my personality didn't fit the mold of what a proper student should be. Maybe you thought you were helping, teaching discipline or responsibility. Instead, you taught me to doubt myself. Tears welled up in Mr. Grayson's eyes, though he quickly wiped them away. He hadn't cried in years, not since his own childhood. But the raw honesty of Marcus's words pierced through his defenses. The letter went on to describe how Marcus's repeated suspensions had isolated him from his peers, strained his relationship with his family, and left him feeling worthless. By the time he dropped out, he had lost faith in himself and the world around him. "I don't hate you," Marcus wrote near the end. "But I wish you'd seen me for who I really was instead of trying to force me into someone I wasn't. If you ever meet another student like me, please remember this letter. Remember that kindness matters more than rules, and understanding can change lives." By the time Mr. Grayson finished reading, his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the paper. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the words etched onto the page. Memories of Marcus flooded back, the way the boy's eyes lit up when talking about his art, the quiet determination in his voice when defending his choices. Mr. Grayson had dismissed those moments as rebellion, but now he saw them for what they truly were, cries for acceptance. That evening, unable to face anyone, Mr. Grayson locked himself in his study at home. He pored over old records from Marcus's time at Maplewood High, searching for answers, or perhaps absolution. What he found only deepened his regret. Among the files was a note from a guidance counselor warning that Marcus showed signs of emotional distress and urging intervention. Mr. Grayson had ignored it at the time, too focused on maintaining order to consider the human cost of his decisions. Meanwhile, outside the walls of his isolation, the protests intensified. Nia joined the demonstrations, standing alongside her friends and speaking publicly for the first time about her experience. Her courage inspired others to share their own stories of being unfairly targeted by school policies. Each account added fuel to the growing movement, putting even more pressure on Mr. Grayson to respond. Unbeknownst to everyone, however, the letter wasn't the only piece of evidence waiting to surface. A former colleague of Mrs. Patterson's had come forward with additional documents, records proving that similar incidents had occurred repeatedly under Mr. Grayson's leadership. If released, these documents would leave no room for denial. Now, though, Mr. Grayson sat alone, grappling with the weight of his past mistakes. Whether he chose to confront them or bury them deeper would determine not just his fate but the future of Maplewood High and everyone connected to it. By Friday morning, the tension at Maplewood High had reached a boiling point. Students, parents, and even some teachers gathered outside the school in record numbers, holding signs that read, "Justice for Nia," and "Change starts now." The protests were no longer just about one girl's suspension. They had evolved into a demand for systemic change. News crews lined the streets, capturing every chant, every speech, and every tear shed by those who felt silenced for too long. Inside the school, Mr. Grayson moved through the hallways like a shadow of his former self. His usual authoritative stride was replaced by slow, hesitant steps. He avoided eye contact with staff members and students alike, unable to shake the weight of Marcus Thompson's letter or the memories it had stirred. For the first time in decades, he questioned whether he'd been wrong all along, not just about Nia, but about so many others whose lives he might have damaged without realizing it. That afternoon, an emergency meeting of the school board was called. Parents filled the auditorium, their voices echoing off the walls as they demanded answers. Board members sat stiffly at the front, unsure how to handle the growing unrest. When Mr. Grayson took the stage to address the crowd, the room fell silent. But, not out of respect, eyes bore into him, some filled with anger, others with disappointment. "I know many of you are upset," he began, his voice uncharacteristically shaky, "and I understand why. What happened with Nia, it has sparked important conversations we needed to have. Conversations about fairness, inclusivity, and how we treat our students." His words hung in the air, met with skeptical stares. Before he could continue, A woman stood up from the audience. It was Mrs. Patterson, her presence commanding despite her age. "You're right, Mr. Grayson," she said firmly. "These conversations are long overdue." But they didn't start with Nia. They started years ago, with Marcus Thompson and countless other students after him. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people turned to look at her. Mr. Grayson's face paled. He hadn't expected this. Confrontation, not here, not now. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished. She held up a folder filled with documents, the records she and her colleague had uncovered, and handed them to the board chair. "These files show a pattern of behavior," she explained. "Suspensions based on subjective interpretations of professionalism, policies that disproportionately affected students of color, and most damning of all, warnings ignored when students showed signs of struggling emotionally." The room erupted into chaos. Parents shouted questions, reporters scrambled to take notes, and board members exchanged panicked glances. Mr. Grayson sank back into his seat, his hands trembling, as he realized the full extent of what was being exposed. Every decision he'd justified as necessary discipline suddenly seemed cruel and unjustifiable. Outside, Nia watched a live stream of the meeting on her phone, surrounded by friends and family. Her heart raced as she listened to Mrs. Patterson speak. Though she hadn't known about Marcus or the other students before, hearing their stories made her feel less alone. It also deepened her resolve to fight for change, not just for herself, but for everyone who came before her and everyone who would come after. As the meeting dragged on, the school board announced a temporary suspension of the dress code policy pending review. They promised to form a committee, including students, parents, and teachers, to rewrite the rules with equity and inclusion in mind. While some celebrated the decision, others weren't satisfied. They wanted accountability, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Later that night, Mr. Grayson returned home to find his house eerily quiet. Sitting alone in his dimly lit living room, he stared at the framed awards on his wall, recognitions for leadership and excellence in education. For the first time, they felt hollow. He thought about resigning, stepping away from the career that had defined his life. But deep down, he knew running wouldn't fix anything. If he truly wanted redemption, he'd have to face the consequences of his actions head-on. Little did he or anyone else know, there was one more twist waiting to unfold. A figure from Marcus Thompson's past was returning to Maplewood, ready to confront Mr. Grayson directly. And when they arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. The following Monday, an unfamiliar car pulled up to the gates of Maplewood High. Out stepped a man in his early 30s, dressed casually but with an air of quiet confidence. His name was Marcus Thompson, the same boy whose letter had shaken Mr. Grayson to his core. Years away from Maplewood had changed him. He carried himself with maturity and purpose, his once timid demeanor replaced by a calm resolve. He wasn't here for revenge or anger. He was here for closure. Word of his arrival spread quickly. Students whispered excitedly in the hallways, teachers exchanged curious glances, and even the news crews returned to capture what promised to be a pivotal moment. Nia, still at the center of the movement she'd inspired, felt a mix of awe and gratitude as she watched Marcus walk onto campus. She approached him hesitantly during lunch, introducing herself and thanking him for speaking out. "You're braver than I ever was," Marcus said with a small smile. "I didn't have people standing up for me like you do now. That's why I'm here, to make sure no one else feels alone." Later that afternoon, Marcus requested a meeting with Mr. Grayson. The principal agreed reluctantly, knowing there was no way to avoid it. They met in the empty library after school, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. For several minutes, neither spoke. Marcus simply stood there, studying the man who had once held so much power over his life. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "I wrote that letter because I wanted you to understand how your decisions affected me," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I didn't write it to hurt you. I wrote it because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd see things differently." Mr. Grayson sat frozen, his hands clasped tightly together. Marcus, he started, but his voice faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again. I never meant to destroy your life. I thought I was doing the right thing, teaching discipline, preparing students for the real world. But reading your letter, hearing Mrs. Patterson talk about you, I realize now that I failed. Not just you, but so many others. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression softening. It's not easy admitting when you're wrong, he said. But it's the first step toward making things right. You've got a chance now to listen, to learn, and to change. Don't waste it. As they talked further, Marcus shared pieces of his journey since leaving Maplewood. He'd struggled initially, bouncing between odd jobs and battling self-doubt. But eventually he found solace in art, using it as a way to heal and connect with others. Now he worked as a mentor for young artists, helping them find their voices and embrace their identities. Hearing this gave Mr. Grayson a glimpse of the potential he'd almost crushed, and the lives he could still impact if he chose to act differently moving forward. News of the meeting leaked to the public, sparking both hope and skepticism. Some saw it as a sign that real change might finally be possible, while others doubted whether Mr. Grayson was capable of genuine transformation. Regardless, the protests continued, fueled by renewed determination. Nia took the lead, organizing workshops and discussions about identity, inclusion, and the importance of representation in schools. Meanwhile, Mr. Grayson faced increasing pressure from the school board. Calls for his resignation grew louder, with some arguing that his presence hindered progress. Others, however, believed he deserved a chance to redeem himself if he proved willing to take it. Torn between guilt and fear, Mr. Grayson spent sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience. Could he stay and fight for the changes needed? Or would stepping aside allow someone better suited to lead? Unbeknownst to everyone, one final piece of the puzzle remained hidden, a proposal drafted by Nia, Marcus, and a group of students aimed at completely overhauling the school's policies. If accepted, it would ensure that no student ever faced the kind of discrimination Nia endured. But getting it approved wouldn't be easy, especially with tensions running high. As the week drew to a close, the entire town held its breath, waiting to see which path Mr. Grayson would choose, and whether justice would truly prevail. The final decision came on a crisp Friday morning, just as the sun began to rise over Maplewood. Mr. Grayson stood before the entire school community, students, parents, teachers, and reporters, in the auditorium where so many heated debates had unfolded. His hands trembled slightly as he held the microphone, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "I've spent my career believing I was doing what was best for this school," he began, pausing to gather himself. "But in trying to enforce rules, I lost sight of something far more important, the people those rules were meant to serve. I failed Marcus Thompson, I failed Nia Johnson, and I failed countless others who deserved better from me." A hush fell over the room. No one had expected such a candid admission. For years, Mr. Grayson had been seen as untouchable, a figure of authority who rarely acknowledged his mistakes. But now, standing there vulnerable and remorseful, he was no longer the same man. "I won't make excuses for my actions," he continued. "Instead, I want to take responsibility. Effective today, I am stepping down as principal of Maplewood High. It's time for new leadership, someone who can guide this school toward a brighter, more inclusive future." The announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd. Some cheered, others sat quietly processing the weight of his words. Nia, seated near the front with her friends, felt a mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and even a flicker of sadness. She knew how difficult it must have been for him to admit his faults publicly. Despite everything, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of respect for his courage. After the meeting, the school board convened to discuss next steps. With input from students, parents, and staff, they unanimously approved Nia and Marcus's proposal to overhaul the dress code policy. The new guidelines emphasized inclusivity, allowing students to express themselves freely while maintaining a respectful learning environment. Workshops on diversity and identity were also introduced, ensuring that every student felt seen and valued. Marcus stayed in town for several weeks, working closely with Nia and other students to implement these changes. Together, they transformed not just the policies but the culture of the school itself. Hallways once marked by conformity became vibrant spaces filled with creativity and individuality. Students wore their hair proudly, dressed in ways that reflected their personalities and celebrated each other's differences without fear of judgment. For Mr. Grayson, stepping away wasn't easy. He spent months reflecting on his life, reading books about empathy and justice, and volunteering at local youth centers. Slowly, he began rebuilding trust within the community, not as an authority figure, but as someone seeking redemption. One day, he received a letter from Nia thanking him for listening and making the hard choice to step aside. It brought tears to his eyes, reminding him that growth was always possible no matter how late you started. As the school year drew to a close, Maplewood High hosted its first-ever Celebration of Identity event. Students showcased art projects, performed spoken word pieces, and shared stories about their journeys of self-discovery. At the center of it all stood Nia, smiling brightly as she addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about hair or clothes," she said, her voice ringing out confidently. "It's about being brave enough to be yourself and supporting others as they do the same. Change doesn't happen overnight, but if we keep standing together, there's nothing we can't achieve." The audience erupted into applause, cheers echoing through the auditorium. Outside, the sun set over Maplewood, casting golden light across the town. It was a moment of hope, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, courage and unity could pave the way for a better tomorrow. And though challenges would undoubtedly arise again, one thing was certain: Maplewood High would never be the same. This concluding part ties up loose ends, delivers emotional resolution, and leaves readers with a message of empowerment and transformation, ensuring the story ends on an uplifting note.